So we're taking a deeper look at Matthew 13, the parable of the sower. And I wanted to do a little experiment. And so I had some of my neighbors and friends read the parable of the sower. And then I kind of interviewed them about the different types of soil and what they think that represents. So let's take a look. So we're talking about Matthew 13, the parable of the sower, which involves farming. And I realized as I'm reading this, I know nothing about farming. So what I've done is consulted our neighborhood expert here, Corey Weber, who runs the community garden here on Blaine Street in Detroit. Again, I don't know anything. What makes good soil? Like, what are the ingredients in good soil? Isn't all dirt just kind of the same?
So the soil that's in these boxes was mostly compost, which is organic material that's broken down into soil. A little bit of rock material to mix in there.
So we're here with my neighbor Aaron, and you read Matthew 13 this week, the parable of the sower. You're familiar with it. In your opinion, what is the good soil?
I think good soil is soft and receptive to things it needs and things it doesn't. And so with the people or the environment around you, there needs to be a softness when the seed is going in, so that it's receptive. It can hold the soil, it can nurture the soil, it has chemicals for it. And that can look like a lot of different things. Some things you might hear already or you might have heard, but I think some of them include love, generosity of time, talents, and the things you own, your possessions.
Okay. What does good soil look like to you?
Good soil looks like a community of trust over a long period of time.
Read through Matthew 13, right, this week. And it's talking about soil, right? And the soil is sort of like kind of a metaphor for like what we're planted in. How can we make like good soil in our communities, in churches, in groups that we're in? What are some of the key ingredients?
That it takes time for soil to develop. Like you're not going to, if you're starting out with difficult soil, it's not going to, it's going to be hard to change it overnight. It takes time for that material to break down into soil, and it takes time for people to figure out how to live together.
Yeah. So what makes bad, what makes bad soil, right?
Sure.
What's the difference between like good soil and bad soil? What is that?
So soil that's going to be difficult to grow in is not going to have a lot of that decayed organic material in it. It's going to be mostly like rock material. It could be really compacted, clay.
That looks to me like people lost in self-interest that doesn't connect to their friends, family, and neighbors.
And then so kind of the flip side, right? What in your opinion does bad soil look like? Soil that makes it difficult for people to grow and flourish. What does that look like to you?
I think bad soil looks like mistrust. When you feel that you don't have people who have your best interest in heart and you can't trust them, or they've done things that have added to that mistrust. Even people with good intentions can become mistrustful people because of our actions. And so I think that requires a level of deep intentionality and deep humility.
All right. It was awesome to get people's thoughts on Matthew 13 and the different kinds of soil. I also had the opportunity to interview somebody who knows a lot about farming, so I present to you this interview with John Atkins, who grew up in Zambia on a farm and is going to add a little more depth to the parable of the sower. So hope you enjoy this discussion. Okay, so I'm here with my good friend from Shanghai, John Atkins. And John is originally from Zambia. And John, you were a farmer in Zambia for a long time, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So thanks, Drew, for having me on.
Yeah, good to see you.
It's good to see you always. So yeah, I come from a farming family. My family's been farming for like 500 years, probably longer than that, but as long as we know. So I grew up on the farm in Zambia, and I farmed there for many years. We have a mixed arable farm there, which means it is a mixture of crops and animals.
Mhm.
But probably the biggest part of the farm is the cropping. So it's growing crops like wheat, like corn, soyas, things like that.
Okay, you're like right on top of it because that was going to be my next question. So, okay. Now, so we're talking about, we're talking about Matthew 13, the parable of the sower. And I was reading this passage this week, and I'm reading it and I realized I don't know anything about farming. And I'm thinking, who can I talk to who knows something about farming? So you came to mind. Now, the farming that they're using in first century Palestine is probably a lot different than like what we would see in the US or Canada, right? What differences would there be?
So, I mean, nowadays farming is obviously super mechanized, and it's actually very high tech. So modern farming is using GPS systems and laser guided and self-driving tractors and all kinds of things. But that doesn't mean that's true for everywhere in the world. So where my family farms, are in the neighborhood where we are, the next door neighbors, you will still see farming that's probably the same as what it would have been in first century Palestine. So they're using oxen, pulling a plow. So that's basically two people with two oxen and a plow getting pulled behind. They'll sow by hand, and they will look after and tend that field all with hand tools. So obviously the sizes of those farms are very small. The fields are very small, just because there's a limited amount that one or two people can really do.
Right.
Whereas modern farming is huge. It's really industrial. It's very technological.
So like in Matthew 13, right? You read the passage earlier today and you're kind of up to date on it. So when he's talking about, scattering the seed, and it's like you have the four different places. You have the path, you have the rocky soil, you have the soil that has a bunch of weeds in it, and then the good soil. I've read that, and again, I'm not a farmer, but when I read that in the past, I thought, okay, 25% goes on each one. Do you think that these are like farmers, right? Do you think that the majority would go somewhere, or what would the breakdown be if you had to guess?
Probably the most. He's going to be trying to get all his seed onto good soil, right? So, but you must understand, we're talking wheat here. So in modern farming methods, when they're planting, we use something called a seed drill. It's a very complicated machine, and it plants the seeds very directly into the soil in a very straight line. And It's very exact. In those days, they didn't have something like that. And wheat is this tiny little grain. So they're literally scattering it. They're doing what they call broadcasting it. And you want to get as much wheat down, because you want to have that coverage so that the weeds won't, or the other plants won't compete with those. So obviously there's going to be parts of the ground that you cover that aren't going to be particularly good. There's where you walk, obviously, that's going to be all compacted. That's essentially what your rocky soil is. Now, actually, rocky soil can be something that we can create. So if we abuse the soil, we compact it too much, it'll become like concrete. And if you try planting that, it'll grow a little bit, but the roots are not going to be able to go in, and the rain won't be able, the water won't, and because the roots aren't able to go through that little cap, what we call a cap, it's this like layer of concrete underneath the topsoil. It just the plant will never really grow. It'll grow, it'll shoot up, but then at a certain stage you can't grow anymore. So when we think of rocky soil, we tend to think of like rocks, right?
Yeah, I think of like rocks, like a gravel or something like that.
But I mean, that can also mean compacted soil, where really the soil has just been abused by years and years and years of very industrial methods where the soil hasn't been looked after. So that's the case. The same, and that would be the path, obviously, as well. But the same could also be, he talks about going, I think, into bushes. I mean, that would be basically saying unprepared soil, somewhere that nobody had prepared. So in reality, I reckon it's probably only about 5% that's falling in there.
So let me add, so the path, right? Because again, I'm trying to like picture this in my head, but you've probably seen fields that are a lot more similar to what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I picture the field, I'm picturing northern Indiana. It's a huge field. There's tractors, there's irrigation. That's what I'm picturing, right?
Yeah.
So the path in those fields, is it sort of like the path in between the rows? Is it like the path leading up to the field? Is it around the perimeter?
Both.
What does that look like?
Both, because of course, where he's walking behind the plow, and even where he's walking when he's scattering the seed, that's going to be compacted. So what he's going to try do, and what we actually still try do nowadays, this is why we use GPS, is that the tractor will go in exactly the same spot as it goes in every year. And what that will do is, it means that where the wheels of the tractor are going over are obviously going to compact. So you're going to try keep those wheels in exactly the same place, and you're not going to plant there. Because if you plant there, nothing's going to really grow very well. So you want to plant your crops where there's been no compaction. So there would have been compaction then, and he would have tried, and now obviously he doesn't have a seed drill, so he's just scattering. So yeah, it literally is a path going through the field.
Okay. Let me ask you the next question here. So switching over a little bit to one of the different areas. So the weeds, right? Obviously you weed, I guess. Again, I don't know. I mean, what do you need to weed? Is it necessary? So if you don't weed, what is the impact?
That's a great question. Firstly, the word weed is terrible. It's just another plant, don't forget. I mean, we kind of give weeds a bad name. A lot of weeds are actually quite beneficial for the biome. But the problem with weeds, obviously, is particularly when you're first growing your plants, when they're trying to shoot up, is that it's a race to the top, quite literally. Whoever gets the most sunlight is going to win out. So we spray a lot of, in modern agriculture, they spray herbicides specifically to try and destroy any of that competition so that those plants can grow. But in reality, some of those weeds can actually be beneficial because they can provide nutrients into the soil. They provide biome into the soil. So the question is, in the old days, they would often plant a number of different seeds together in a crop to kind of get a mixed crop so that some would grow high, others would grow out. In North America, they famously would plant what they call the three sisters. So they would plant corn, they would plant squash, and they would plant bean seeds together. The squash would go out and kind of cover the ground so weeds couldn't come up. The corn would grow upward very quickly, and then that would give something for the beans to latch onto. Mm. So they'd already thought ahead about how to deal with this. So they definitely would have weeded at the beginning. Once your crop starts to grow, though, you can't do that anymore, particularly with wheat, because it's so thick on the ground. So you would try weed your crop before you planted, and then you would want your crop to grow as fast as possible. Now, if there are weeds in that wheat, yeah, they're there. Now, nowadays they do use all kinds of pesticides to basically get rid of those weeds. But in reality, they don't really do anything because the wheat is so thick that they're going to basically cover all the ground. They're going to outcompete any other plant anyway. So you just get rid of them in the harvest.
So now I'm gonna have to go back and think about what you just said there. So basically, if it's a race to the top. If the weeds are there, once everything starts growing, they're just kind of there. That's kind of interesting. So you got to take care of them in the beginning. I'm sure there's some spiritual application in there that I'll try to figure out in the next couple of days.
Yeah. It's all about a good start.
It's all about a good start. Okay, that's great. Let me ask you this question. So, you've planted in lots of different soils. What are some important ingredients in good soil? Obviously, there's good soil and bad soil, right? I mean, so when
one word,
yeah,
life. So really, and that's what it comes down to. I mean, the study of soil, an agronomist, and nowadays it's very, very, very in depth and scientific, but they'll tell you, agronomists in one word is life. The more life in your soil, the better your soils are. So in a little teaspoon of soil, you have all kinds of bacteria and microfungi and mycorrhizas and everything else. And these are doing 1,000 million different things. It's an absolute unbelievable amount of life below the ground. And the more life there is in the soil, the healthier, the more nutritious the soil is. Those little they create this kind of superhighway of connected like filaments, I guess is the best way to describe it. And they move nutrients all over, I mean, over great distances. And so if your plant is in that soil, they have access not just to the nutrients right around them, but they'll have access to nutrients that can be quite far away. Mm-hmm. And so the healthier, the more life that is in your soil, the stronger your plant is. And we often think about plants from the top, and we kind of look after our plants above ground. But in reality, about 50% of the nutrition for a plant is from below the ground. Healthy soil really is the key. And if you can look after your soils, if you can promote life in those soils, you will have incredibly productive crops.
So the flip side, again, what is bad soil? What does that look like? How does it happen?
How does it happen?
Yeah.
Normally bad soil actually occurs through human abuse. That's the real simple. And probably a classic example is the Dust Bowl in the prairies in the 1930s, 1940s, right, where they plowed the soil and they created, as I said, they created that rocky soil. The grasses couldn't grow down, the plants couldn't grow down, they couldn't access the nutrients. Don't forget the sun, if the soil is exposed, the sun will just burn everything, right? So the top 4 inches of the soil becomes an oven. Nothing can survive in that heat. It'll just get scorched. So you want to protect your soil. So soils that are bare, soils that have been overused, soils that are not rested, soils that do not get, you've got to give biomatter to go feed the soils. You've got to feed the soils with biomass. You've got to give them biomass to make the soils grow. So those become sterile. And I mean, that's essentially what a desert is. The desert is a place where there is no life. There's no water. There's no biomass. And so you just have dirt. That dirt has no life in it. Nothing will grow there.
Okay. So this is relating to that, right? You said one of the things that can cause soil to go bad, right?
It's abuse.
Rest. It's just overuse, just too much, just going. Yeah. So my final question, I guess, unless we can kind of think of more questions here, but I think we're already kind of over time, but so do you let the ground lie fallow? Why do you do that? How often do you do that? What is that process like? How do you choose do you know okay, that field this year needs to just rest? How do you do that?
So they already did this in the Bible. So every 7 years, they would let one of the fields go fallow. That's kind of a Jubilee year. And scientific evidence has shown this is absolutely what you do. Now, most farmers won't let an entire field go fallow because they're like, well, I need it. So what they do is every year you let 1/7 of any field be fallow. Now, when we say fallow, we don't mean we just walk away. What most farmers nowadays would do, and they probably did this even in biblical times, is they'll plant a cover crop. They'll plant a good crop, something that is just going to build into the soil, that's going to give to the soil, something with a lot of biomass. And then they'll just leave it on there. And that will come to its full growth. And then naturally it'll die down. And all that nutrients and the biomass is going to go back into the soil. And that's really what resting the soil is. It's not really resting it in the sense that we think of resting, doing nothing.
Leaving it blank. Leaving it empty.
It's allowing the soil to have that time to recover the biomass, to give back to the soil. Remember, the problem with fertilizers is fertilizers are very quick, so they just get used up that one season. They don't stay in the soil. Whereas biomass breaks down over time, and by giving that biomass for a year, it's actually going to build up the soil. And if you keep doing that, if you do that every 7 years, and you only need to do that every 7 years, and I mean, they weren't fools, right? They did trial and error, so they figured out after 1,000 years, 7 years is about the right one, right? So every 7 years, it literally does work. And if you rest your land every 7 years, if you let it lie fallow every 7 years, it's very sustainable. And so absolutely, that's what we did. We had a rotation system, and we did a seventh of every field every year. And you just kind of do, our fields are round, right? Because it's irrigation. So a little pie of that every year would be left fallow, and you just move it around, and it works great.
So final question here before we kind of sign off, but what kind of plants, so you plant a good crop, you let it grow, and then you let it die, and it kind of goes into the soil. What kind of plants would that be? Like,
so you would want something that's going to be a nitrogen fixer. Mm-hmm. So any kind of legume normally is a nitrogen fixer, but it can be all kinds of things. It depends what you're trying to build for that particular time of the year. In fact, normally we would plant a cocktail. So we'd have about 6 different plants, some that have very deep roots, because you want to break down that soil, some that have a lot of biomass, so you just want all that biomass basically getting broken down the soil, some that are nitrogen fixtures, so we would have a legume, we might have a vetch, we might have a grass even, and we would want it fairly quick growing, so the more biomass you can have, the better, but you would often have a mixture, and you would put that in, and that really does it's actually, I mean, it's like a tonic. It's like super steroids for the soil. It really is incredible.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.
Hey, good to see you, and hope you have a great week.
You too.